Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for being with us this morning. So we've had an opening conversation with Professor Sheila Foster. We had this last panel that was more focused on global trends. We have just a really unique and wonderful opportunity right now to enter into dialogue with Professor Richard Bradley. Rich has been on the faculty here at the Urban and Regional Planning Program at Georgetown for many years and has, in many ways, led the process of creating a curriculum around placemaking and place management in our program. Rich is kind of an all-star and celebrity here in Washington, D.C., having been the founder and president and CEO of the Downtown DC Business Improvement District. That was a position that he held for many years. And prior to that, he held a position at the International Downtown Association that we just heard from David Downey. Rich, thank you so much for being with us here today. This is a really exciting opportunity to talk about your work and especially talk about the insights associated with your work and your research. Can you take us, let's start off with, we've had this kind of high level of kind of more theoretical conversation with Professor Foster and kind of high level trends associated with the International Downtown Association and the World Bank. Let's take this down to basics. Generally, I think people are familiar with the term place making. The term place management is still evolving and getting broader recognition. Take us back into the relationship between the two and what the kind of origins of this conversation are in the first place.
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind introduction. What you didn't mention, which is most important, is I have a master's degree in junior high school education, which is, I always explain, makes me an expert in urban politics. And to a certain extent, maybe that's a useful metaphor because I think it speaks to the messiness, in the good sense, of what's going on in terms of urban development today and has always been part of it. If we look back, I think you would find that the placemaking movement, but probably place management, sort of finds its way, at least in the United States, the nexus most of us find is the relationship between William Holly White and with Jane Jacobs. The two sort of fed off each other. And the interesting thing, relative to your focus here, is that Holly White was a researcher. Yeah. And he followed the prescription of a then baseball catcher for the New York Yankees, who was known mostly for his mouth problems, but who once said, you can see a lot by looking. And essentially, what Holly White did, and I think Jane Jacobs did, is they looked and they told what they saw. And so what they've done in some respects is sort of set the framework. And so from their beginning, and what I would say is that placemaking and place management was sort of on the edge. It's now at the center. It's moved from the periphery to being a core. And where you see that, quite frankly, is in, for example, the recently announced plan for downtown San Francisco, its renewal plan, is a public realm plan. And even the efforts in downtown Washington are around the issues of what you can do to enhance place. So place is now a central strategy in the larger framework of what I would say urban development. And in fact, if you go back into the sort of the late 90s, the time in which there was sort of a merger of placemaking within the public-private partnership model, excuse me, and the result of that essentially was the creation of the bids. And that kind of supercharged, if you like, the kind of place management efforts, which were keyed probably at that point in time, understandably, to issues of urban maintenance and security and things like that. But people began to realize that if you could design a place that was safe and secure, but then you created the opportunity for people to stay. I mean, there's another kind of a line that many of us remember from a Kevin Costner movie about Field of Dreams, and he built a baseball field in the middle of Iowa in hopes that great baseball players would come there. And the line was, build it and they will come. I think many of us have learned is manage it and they'll stay. And so these forces sort of came together, and I think that's what's sort of propelling things forward today.
Yeah, it's so interesting because we think of placemaking also as a kind of cultural practice,
Yeah.
you know, of a way of welcoming people to a place, a way of programming places. But place management really does get into a lot of additional ongoing sets of activities around research, around understanding who you are as a community, understanding the attributes of place. I think that's really, really interesting. Let's, you know, you talk about cities as being messy places in the best sense of that. You are really interesting for us here in this conversation because you've been there, you've done it. You were instrumental in bringing stakeholders together to form the place management organization that we know as the Downtown DC Business Improvement District. Take us back to those early steps to actually establish a value proposition that welcomed stakeholders into this level of coordination and collaboration that was otherwise not present. You know, it's a capacity building exercise that, but for the establishment of a place management organization, would not have existed. So what was it, and how did you bring these different stakeholders together to kind of get started?
Well, in some respects, we had a propulsive momentum in the city. As you call, the city kept on hard times, and the business community was looking for a way to be responsive. They realized they wanted to be regionally competitive. They felt they were losing that option. Mm-hmm. So I think what we did is we essentially got together a group of property owners, and we said, look, here's what's going on elsewhere. And to a certain extent, I think envy of other places is always a good model. Right. So they began to take a look at that and began to say, well, what is it we have to do to get there? So it started out at the level of the business community, but there was the public sector also said, we don't have the resources to sort of provide that kind of higher level of attention to detail. And what many of us had as a good example was with the shopping center and the shopping malls, because they are managed places. And we realized that condos are managed places. And so we said, that's the piece that's missing, a higher level of attention to the details. So whether or not should the trash cans be 36 inches tall or 48 inches tall? How often should you pick up the paper on the sidewalk? What kind of plantings should you have? What kind of lights do you need to have? What's the level of the lights? All those details sort of became part and parcel of what needed attended to. So one hand it was design, and one hand it was management. And I think people began to understand, particularly property owners, they were part of that value proposition because for their own buildings they had that idea in mind. So it was really a generalization of a property management model in shopping center and in big mixed-use projects, and they said, let's apply that now to this public space.
I just want to recall this conversation we just had a few minutes ago in the previous panel where the question was around, you know, the question was around war, but it was really about a crisis in the city. And it's hard for us sometimes to remember that only 25, 30 years ago, our own city here in Washington, D.C. was in fiscal crisis. Right. And so that was a backdrop for the kind of coalition building exercise.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I think, however, but the interesting part here is that when these organizations came together, they realized they could do other things besides actually just making the place clean, safe, and friendly. I had a board member at one time who wanted to say, well, I'm going to give you a T-shirt, Rich, and it's going to have clean, safe, and friendly written on it backwards. I assume you sleep in a T-shirt. I want you to see that the first thing in the morning. But the interesting thing was by getting the business community together, it now created an opportunity to enter into relationships with the public sector in ways so that began the governance. But the other thing it did is it really opened the door to working with the broader community. And I want to make a distinction that people don't make enough, and I think some of the critique the level it bids is the distinction between formal power and authority and informal. What bids were as a formal structure, as a tax structure, there had to be people to collect it and have some say over it. But they were never limited to whom you could deal with. And many of us began to conceive of these organizations not as business improvement, but community improvement districts, and reached out in a variety of ways. And so we began to deal with everything from how do we deal with homelessness, how can we deal with access to jobs, economic equity. Who were we contracting services for? There were wonderful models in South Africa, which essentially they turned to the former fighters in the movement, in the anti-apartheid movement, and they came in and began the management districts. They ran the management districts and provided security, when they had essentially been doing security for the African National Congress. Anyway, my point there is just we've had this great sort of explosion of opportunity to gauge many more kinds of things than we thought we could when we started.
Right. The other issue here that in the North American context is sometimes hard to remember is the intense place-based competition between central cities and the periphery, especially rapidly growing suburbs with big shopping malls. I can imagine that was an economic issue that many property owners certainly understood as like an existential threat.
Very much so. But the interesting thing I would just add today is that the reverse is not true, that the suburbs are urbanizing. Right. And they looked at the very techniques that essentially were created in the 90s and the early 2000s to be competitive with the shopping centers. They've said, aha, we can learn from those placemaking, place management. So place is important focus. I'm doing some work in Tysons, Virginia right now, which is one of the large sort of urban centers, suburban urban centers. And the core approach is really what can they do to enhance place? How can they get people to live there? Stay there and enjoy this place. So I think you're seeing this kind of a competitiveness, and it has a virtual cycle, because I think we'll learn from each other and I think move it to the next level.
So building on that, so many of these examples are really, the genesis is kind of an economic imperative to attract people to an urban place. It's kind of like the classic urban regeneration dilemma. Along the way, in the best of examples, and certainly you embody this, there's momentum that's built. And places are beginning to get rediscovered. They are no longer only a place of business activity. You oversaw the integration and attraction of many cultural institutions to the downtown, as well as the very first attempts, really, to attract residents to the downtown. So on your journey, as you were overseeing the comeback of Washington, D.C.'s downtown, how did the activities of place management kind of grow and evolve and diversify to embody a whole series of different actions?
Well, I think it was once we shifted the prism and the viewpoint from just that we were an economic institution to the idea that we were a community development institution. We then began to say, so what brings community together? And what you begin is all these other resources bring community together. Not only I would say cultural institutions, but also universities. I mean, the location of this university's facility of Georgetown, off the hill, down here, I think is very significant. Down here into downtown is very significant. And the McCourt School is following. So you have universities have now found their way here. But we had to create a space, again, in which they would feel comfortable and they could grow. And these institutions would be as valued, even though they didn't produce taxes in the normal sense. They produced people and they produced a reason to be here.
Yeah. How, take us down into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of forming an organization. Who did you hire as staff? What did they do? And then please talk about the ambassadors and the role that they have played in really defining what place management organizations are.
Sure. I think in terms of sort of getting started, I kiddingly used to say when I were in the International Downtown Association, do two of the following three things and something will happen. Invite in a speaker, take a trip, and hold a retreat. So the idea was to essentially get information here, and I referred to that earlier. And that got us started, but it also gave us the models in which we had to begin to work together to move forward. In terms of the staff, they didn't necessarily come from the planning field. They came from a variety of things. They were very much people who felt a mission. They had maybe some planning framework, but it was often many people who were, like myself, old junior high school teachers, English majors, sociologists, good communicators, good storytellers. And there was some, competencies were needed, but they were really sort of in the property management field. The attention to getting trash off the street, or how to deploy security who are friendly but work with the formal police authority. Those are, that can be learned. So it was really a matter, I think, of building spirit and attracting people who were interested in that. And so the field is sort of beginning to professionalize itself, but it wasn't at the start. Right. It was very much a mission-oriented people who felt strongly about the role of cities, a role of the social dimension of the city, and the role of spirit of the city. And they realized that there had to be a generation of lots of places where people could gather, and that's where the spirit was realized.
Yeah, so interesting. Let's build on that, this idea of the spirit of the city, and talk explicitly about cultural activities, cultural institutions. As I said before, you were part of a process to actually attract cultural institutions to the downtown. But in a very, very different way, you were also really instrumental in thinking about the role of festivals in the city, cultural festivals, and of course we have the kind of hallmark festival of the Cherry Blossom Festival here in Washington. Was that something that happened on the side? Was it understood as core to the mission? How did culture play into an actual place management strategy?
The term of art is sort of activation. And so sometimes the activation can be around a busker, it can be around a vendor, it can be around something that just starts up on its own, or it can be planned. And so it could be yoga exercises. But it could be something larger. It could be kind of festivals. So I think that was always implicit at the start, but realize that like a farmer's market in many respects is an event, as much as it is a place where you go and buy something. And it was sort of building on that became important. At the downtown bid, we realized that there was this wonderful organization that was struggling at one point in time called the National Cherry Blossom Festival. So we said, well, we'll just protect it. We'll kind of invite it in, its own structure, we'll try to enhance it as best we can, and then let it kind of grow. But it was a mutual sort of beneficial society, if you like. We were able to sort of both benefit from that effect. Tim Tompkins, who I think will join you shortly, has done some research for the Plan Association in New York, and he's noted that I think last year someone did some surveys of New York. Bids put on something like 1,500 events, but maybe it was more than that, but it attracted more than 34 million people to events and activities. So when you think what sports do, now that we've been able to replicate that in terms of events and other kinds of things. So this is the whole notion of convening, but the core of it, of course, is that the convening itself has to be done in a way that people feel secure, but it in turn provides that, if you like, the secondary benefit of giving people a sense that it is secure, and it makes it secure because of the consequence.
Yeah, and I think, going back to Sheila Foster's comments earlier this morning, this idea of the commons and who is the downtown for. These festivals are really very interesting vehicles to bringing all kinds of people to a place, not necessarily for an economic transaction, but to build social capital within a city.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. And I think, again, that's a point sometimes that gets missed when people focus on the structure of like a business improvement district. Who's on the board, who's not on the board. What you look at is what does it do, and who does it help, and who are getting the jobs, and where is the fiscal benefit coming from? We would do research about what we call the net fiscal benefit of downtown Washington, and that's the difference between what was raised in taxes and what it was expended. And it came close to $1 billion of transfer of money that was going now to the council to spend for education, but it was indirect, not necessarily direct. But the whole notion is that it was creating social capital, and that was creating fiscal capital and economic capital.
And I think for many people who are newcomers to Washington or who have just visited recently for the first time, it's hard for them to imagine Washington D.C.'s downtown 20 and 30 years ago. I mean, there were many empty parking lots. There was nowhere near the level of vitality that exists today. How would you characterize that shift?
We stole a mantra from Times Square when it got started. And I think the person, Gretchen Dykstra, who created it, referred to it when it started as dull, dirty, and dangerous. And I think we fell into all those categories. We were dull. We were mostly bureaucrats and lawyers. We were dirty. No one really paid much attention to it. And it wasn't so much that it was dangerous, but a perception of danger. So I think the mantra that came on top of that was make it clean, safe, and friendly. And that's how you got to the ambassadors. This is how you hired people who not only would help with supplemental cleaning, but would welcome a welcoming presence. And those were the kinds of basic steps you begin to move forward as you sort of begin to grow ourselves into what is now the place. But we were, in the 1990s, like many other cities who, for different reasons, were struggling. And I say this is the interesting sort of evolution in a best of sense that today the center cities are struggling, particularly in terms of the office market. I think people have now come back to the cultural institutions, they've come back to the restaurants, the sales taxes are up, that's a great value. But the way to sort of draw attention to it is then really focus on the activations. And I think that'll be the kind of, that's what I refer to in terms of San Francisco and Washington, in terms of the reimagining the downtowns.
I want to go back to this issue of the shopping mall, because it is maybe a bit more of a historic issue for us in Washington, but it's a very real challenge in cities around the world where you have traditional commercial centers competing with shopping malls. And at the same time, we have the amazing digital revolution that's occurring in cities around the world around e-commerce. Are these just long-term trends that urban places and urban place managers need to just kind of adapt to? Or is there kind of a strategic strategy that is evolving that you see of really celebrating place in this more digitized economy that is occurring, and really not just in developed markets, but really around the world?
I would just say that there's another kind of economy that you sort of below that, we call it the experience economy. I think what we really learned over the years is essentially, even in retail, it's selling a product or selling a service. What was the kind of experience that got created around it? And I think we've generated that concept, or generalized that concept, to think about the downtown. So the issue is, what can you do from an experiential point of view? And I think that's the layer that we're talking about here. And so people today, when they talk about brand, what's the brand of a downtown or a brand of a product? It's what's the promise of an experience? Yeah. What are you offering? And so that filter, that brand filter, that experience filter, and that experience filter gets to an emotional level. If people are going to come and stay somewhere, be somewhere, they probably want to do it with friends, they want to do it with people they care about, and they want to enjoy other people. As Holly White told us, what we enjoy doing most as human beings is watching other human beings.
Right. Rich, you have this incredible reservoir of experiences to draw from. Let's set out the crystal ball here. Talk to us about longer-term trends in the future. Where does place management fit in the future city?
As I said, it's moved to the center place, so I think that's number one. But secondly, I think it's pushing the boundaries, as I'm now finding working out in Tysons, into the suburban areas. It's really, I think you'll shift away from seeing the primary justification to be economic, business improvement. We'll find other terms and words to describe it. I think it will, as we go forward, the very fact that we have kind of students emerging here with a kind of background, I see it as a kind of, again, back to the wonderful messiness that Jane Jacobs saw on her sidewalks when she went out in the morning. What it will really do is to help us touch base with all those pieces, all those elements that you noted even earlier today, that there's so many components that go into place. We're going to find our way enhancing all of them. We're learning so much about whether or not it's how do you deal with traffic, or how do you deal with bus services, or where do you put the bike paths, and to what's the kind of best way you get gum off the sidewalk, or how do you engage people in the most interesting activations, that not only festivals but marketplaces.
Yeah. Rich, thank you so much for spending this time with us this morning.
This is fun. Thank you.
That's great, and we look forward to your ongoing engagement in the roundtables and in the closing session in December. We're going to take a short 5-minute break, and then we'll proceed with our final panel.
Okay, you're clear.
Thanks.
Thanks, sir. Good.
It's great.
It's fun. So we'll take my, don't want to run away with the microphone.
It's going through your ties.
All right, I see.
I think one of your guys left his cell phone in here.
Yeah, there you go.
That David? That's why David's staying around.
So we'll move this one. I'll sit here, I guess. Or should I continue? Yeah, I'll sit in the middle.
I think I like you in the middle more.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Do you have a special places for people?
No, I
to sit?
haven't really thought about it, so.
Uba's sitting here.
I'll sit there. Yeah. Yeah. Kenyatta make it? Hey!
Yeah.
Here's some water.
You just wired up though.
Yeah, the cool setup. Really nicely, yeah.
How are you? Thank you so much.
You're not making it easy on you.
Oh, well, I just like
Yeah.
put it all together. Let's see. Let's split the New Yorkers. How about that? Yeah, we just sit here. I'll sit in the middle. And then,
Yeah.
hey, how are you?
Good.
Thank you so much.
I don't commute.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Did David get his phone?
Yeah. Yeah, isn't it cool? Really cool. Yeah, it's really wild.
Tell Marnique she did a good job.
I know. His wife designed the space. Yeah, isn't that funny? That's great.
Yeah, sure. So we're unveiling the mural next week on Friday. Uva.
Oh, that's so awesome.
Gotta
I'm gonna come.
deconflict.
I'm gonna come to that
I
for
gotta
sure.
be conflicted with the synagogue.
Oh, next Friday.
But I
Oh,
got
I'm not gonna be here. That's too bad.
With 6 in the eye. So
That's amazing.
said just be done by 7.
Yeah. All right. Actually, this is perfect. I'm going to start with you. What's it like? What's it like to run a PMO? I'm going to talk to you about what is it like to manage a network of PMOs. Kind of introduce that. Then Ethan